Okay, hello everyone, thank you all for coming. My name is Colin Graham and I'm leading this series of interviews which are called My Identity. The guests that we've had so far, the series is in two parts, and maybe at the end I'll mention to you where you can listen back to some of the previous interviews. We've just begun a podcast series, and the previous interviews have been very much like this one, in-person event, live and recorded, and you can watch them back on YouTube. The guests that I've had so far in the series have tended to be people with something to say, particularly about the north of Ireland and about the potential reunification of the island, because that's the remit of the Aaron's project. And while that obviously fits very well within the remit of what Aaron's is trying to do, it's only one way of thinking about identity on the island today, that is in the kind of the political sense of how the north of Ireland might be reintegrated or unified with the rest of Ireland. My guest today, Manchán Magan, gives us potentially another perspective on identity, one that is maybe ancient, modern and contemporary. Manchán, as you all know, and I'm sure you're all here because you know his work, he's a thinker, he's a traveller, he's a television presenter, and he's a writer. He has developed what I think is a very unique approach to understanding the living history of the Irish language and the Irish landscape, particularly through his books 32 Words for Field and Listen to the Land Speak. And he's recently published Brehons and Brahmins, which is the first in a trilogy of books considering the connections between Ireland and other ancient cultures. So maybe just join me in welcoming Manchán today. Manchán, thanks so much for agreeing to talk to us today. We really look forward to the conversation. Just to say to everyone, we'll talk for about 45 minutes, maybe a little bit longer, and we'll leave a bit of time at the end for questions as well. So let's begin maybe with a very broad question, which is, as I mentioned, when I've carried out these conversations with other people and asked them about their identity or their sense of what identity is, they're often answering within the framework of Northern Ireland, within an idea of whether they are unionist or nationalist, and people get very uncomfortable with that question, understandably, because they're intelligent and they don't want to be pigeonholed. But it strikes me that in asking you a question about your identity, your answer might be very, very different than the answers we've had before in this series. So when I ask you, when you think about the title of the series, My Identity, what immediately arises in your mind?
Yeah, it's such a complex issue, and it's probably been shifting, every decade or maybe now every few years. But now I say I'm Irish. I'm definitely happy with that idea. But then what does Irish mean? And that's meant different things for me at different times. At the moment, what I'm comfortable with is this idea is Irish means an expression of the people who are currently living on this island, and I feel a deep connection with those, but also all of those Irish people who left this island, particularly over the last few centuries, that we still have some connection to. But as I say, it shifts, and there was no simple, I can't say like I'm a Dublin man or something like that. That didn't feel right for me. I know I was brought up, a lot of my life, 3/4 of my youth was spent in Dublin, but then because we had this other foot in West Kerry, I have that strong connection with the Irish language and that Kirk-Corrina, that West Kerry mindset. And that sort of dichotomy, that sort of dual view meant that when I suddenly turned 18 or 19 and was asked, now become a member of this society, I didn't know what society it meant. I didn't feel comfortable with either. Certainly not the Donnybrook society in which I was born, and yet I knew I wasn't West Kerry enough to be there. So I went abroad. I went, traveling in India, in Africa, in South America. And I felt such an unanish, Irichin the Nask, such a connection with people in the cultures of the world that I realized, why am I limiting my sense of identity to just what's on this island? In fact, I feel more of a sense of oneness with people in different parts of the world, with people who are living a life, in other words, close to a spiritual nature, which was always something important to me, and close to nature itself, or close to land. So it's those sort of mixed things that gave me my sense of identity, but then also, of course, that makes you alienated from a lot of other things. The minute you have a sense of identity, then you're not other things, and it can be kind of lonely.
So is the term identity maybe too modern or contemporary a term for what you're describing? You're describing something potentially either both global and local, and potentially very ancient in a way, or old. So is it a useful term for you? And we use the term, I suppose, in two ways. One is in a personal sense, almost in a kind of post-psychology sense, and then in a political science sense to identify with a particular affiliation. Is it something that's useful, or would you think of another way of describing yourself?
Yeah, it's going to be increasingly not useful. So it's very useful now for getting a passport or for paying my taxes. I know to whom I should pay my taxes. But in terms of, in a world where migration is going to be increasingly the norm, in fact, in a world where migration was always the norm and is going to increasingly be the norm, and where there isn't this sort of limited idea of borders, it's going to become understood that this was an idea that really took root in a strong way in the 19th century, and maybe go the 18th century. But like before that, we were clans, we were regions. And now I live in Collinstown, County Westmeath. And we have such a marked identity compared to those down the road in Castlepollard. We're very different from those. You know, I am a Collinstown man now for the last 27 years. I'm not a Castlepollard man. So I think it's that idea, you know, that idea of dúchas, an áit dúcha. So dúchas is heritage, and it's from Shemohoicha, my place. But dúcha means, it doesn't just mean place, it means the place which I am a custodian of. So it's a place rooted in land, and that has no fixed borders, because how rooted, I am rooted to my land, okay, which, well, let's say the 10 acres I own. There's a little stream going to it. And one direction it goes down into Loch Adil and then goes into the Boyne. And then 2 fields from my house, it comes from Loch Lane. And Loch Lane goes underground to Loch Derryvarra, which goes to the Shannon. So my land is connected to the Shannon and to the Boyne, the 2 great sacred rivers of Ireland. Now, if I explain that to any Indigenous person anywhere in the world, they would understand that as a sense of her identity. That is my land is connected to those lakes. My bog is probably the local moor bog, the bog beside me. My hill, we don't have really any hills where I am, but I have Mullaghmeen. So if you root yourself to the land, then you're connected to the rivers, the trees, the land, the forests that are all connected into it. So I think all of us are going to be expanding our sense of identity, while using the simple Irish identity for practical purposes at the same time.
Mm-hmm. So we want to come on and talk a little bit later about, again, that sense of landscape and the connection that landscape gives you, both spiritually and historically, or maybe mythically almost. But it would be really useful, and at the end we're going to come back maybe and think about the potential political impact of your ideas in the world that we live in today, and you've already alluded to that. It would be really useful for everyone here, I think, and for me, to get a sense of your family background, because I can see in your work that the way that you think about Ireland, the Irish language, the Irish landscape, and you describe this really beautifully in your work, comes from the kind of political participation that your family members had in previous generations. And yet also it strikes me that in some ways your engagement with Ireland is different than theirs, in that the O'Rahilly, for example, and your grandmother, Sheila Humphreys, were very much attuned to the contemporary politics of their time. They were people who looked to shape the future of the island in profoundly political ways while having a sense of its history. And to some extent, your take differs from theirs. So it would be lovely to hear you talk about the impact that that family background has had on shaping who you are, and then maybe your reflections on whether there are real differences and where those differences occurred.
Yeah, so like in one way, Listen to Land Speaks and 32 Words for the Field are manipulating an identity. They're creating a particular identity, a story, which is what you do when you write a book. But equally, Sheila and the O'Rahilly were doing the same. So it sort of goes back to Aegon O'Rahilly, to my great granduncle 4 generations back, who was the last great poet of the old Bardic school. You know, born 1670s, died 1740s, and you know, he was, as I said, the last great poet of the old Bardic school, and that entitled him to wear a cloak of crimson bird feathers. So when you have that image, that's basically shamanic. He was connecting back to a druidic sensibility going back thousands of years. So he was a big influence on the O'Rahilly. Like for the O'Rahilly, he was just his great-granduncle 2 generations back. And so the O'Rahilly was sparked into, founding the Irish Volunteers, and then which became the IRA, and fun, becoming such a key part in Cunnan Gaeilge in the Gaelic League, because he felt that he just felt this uninish, this identity with Eoghan O'Rahilly, with the great poet, and he also realised that he was part of that movement towards an idea of nationalism, of identity in the late 19th century. So he's inspired by that, and he reshapes that story, Eoghan O'Rahilly's story, to become something. And then Sheila, my granny, in a post-1916, when the O'Rahilly dies in 1916, Sheila then again remolds that story. And what they do, they make the story of Ireland almost into the Fighting Irish. We were talking about that with Notre Dame, with the American universities, that are so much about the Fighting Irish. They took the idea of Finn McCool and Cuchulainn and made those key figures of our identity because they knew they were at a time where they were going to need to fight. If there was ever going to be a time where I could write a book about the Irish language that would sell so well, where we could have TV programs in Irish that me and my brother could make, they needed to sacrifice that themselves 100 years ago, or we could have lost everything. So all of that sacrificing that had been done in the centuries before, particularly at the time of the famine, where those great parents decided to tell their children, to make sure their children wouldn't speak English, that they would only wouldn't speak Irish, they would only speak English, so they could go to America, go to Australia, go to Britain, and make a career, and maybe either come back to a free Ireland or send money back to feed those here, so that the culture, the language, that mindset, that Weltanschauung could continue. So they, created a warring story for themselves, and got very involved with that and sacrificed themselves to such a degree. And then that led to the position where I could, tell my story. But it wasn't only that, of course, there was the O'Rahilly, but there was also T.F. O'Rahilly and Cecil O'Rahilly in the School of Advanced Studies, who were rifling through the old folklore, translating the Táin Bó Cúailnge. And my other cousin, Murphy, James Murphy, isn't it James Murphy, who wrote this is not James. Yeah, it is. Who wrote the collection of Irish nature poems, was also looking back at our history and finding ways to tell the story of our identity in more romanticized, in more appealing ways that then I was able to slot into. They were part of my world when I was growing up, because that was, and again, my father had this close friendship with Hubert Butler, so I was being fed these ways of seeing the world. And Peter Harbison, during the 80s, every summer he would bring me along the peninsula, the Dingle Peninsula. He was developing an idea of pilgrimage, that every stone on the Dingle Peninsula, if one walked to it, one could see the top of Mount Brandon, the great stone there. So I was just this young teenager stuck at home. He would bring me along there, again, introducing me to a far older idea of Irishness, to an idea that went at least 2,000 years back, and some of, when he was looking at Neolithic sites, further back again. So as you say, I am a product of all of those who went before me, who were trying to tell a story of our identity, and I'm just the next step.
I didn't know the Hubert Butler connection. So what came from the Hubert Butler line, do you think, intellectually in your family? What was the connection there? Yeah,
so my dad was just fascinated by local history. What's interesting, again, I used to love coming to the RAA because the Pope O'Mahony, his sculpture was on the stairs, and Pope O'Mahony, this great rambling bohemian sort of knowledge man, almost, a wayward shaman who knew so much about the family history. He was the nearest we have to an old druid, almost homeless genius who would wander the roads and knew both my father and my mother very well, because my father was just so involved in the Georgian Society and the Friends of National Collections in local history, and my mum's then her lineage back to the O'Rahillys. So they would have they were in that world of just being obsessed with the history, not only the general history, but actually the history of every place and how one knits that together to create a unified whole.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I suppose other people faced with that heritage and drawing on that heritage might still have gone towards the political, the contemporary political. So why do you think you haven't as much? Maybe not depends on how you define the political, but largely speaking, you haven't moved to, in the same kind of political circles that would be equivalent to what some of your ancestors did anyway. Has that been a very deliberate decision, or is it simply how you've filtered that set of interests that you've described?
I mean, interesting. I ran for the general election for the Green Party in 2016, but that was it was only for 4 months, and I left the Green Party after it. So there must have been some impact. But you're right, I definitely didn't become political. And whereas my mother would still, in other words, Sheila Humphrey's daughter, would still see herself very involved with Sinn Féin, would still see that direct lineage. With Rita O'Hare and all those the people who were trying to keep who saw themselves as keeping a flame alive. I just had this, I think, profound either pacifist influence or just this spiritual side in me that I always saw politics as somewhat manipulated. It just wasn't the way my brain worked. My brain works in more idealistic, more expansive, more romantic ways. I wasn't either practical enough or maybe pragmatic enough or cynical enough to get involved.
Well, I mean, it seems to me that while you're not cynical enough is good, while you may not be party political, your work has an immense potential political impact in the sense that it changes the way that people think. Well, let's go on and talk a little about your take on the Irish language. And in those two books that I mentioned, in one way, 32 Words for Field is about the language and Listen to the Land Speak is about the land, but neither of them are separate, and it's maybe the emphasis is slightly different in each, but they both are interested in both simultaneously because that's how you see the world. But maybe let's start a little bit with your sense of the Irish language. There's something immensely evocative. It's funny, as I have an academic background in English, and one of the things, obviously, that anyone who's lecturing and professor of English in Ireland has an interest in W.B. Yeats and revival, and it's something that's always fascinated me. In preparing for this, I just increasingly felt like I was going to be talking to young W.B. Yeats, in the sense of the kind of interest that Yeats and his contemporaries had, particularly in the 1880s. And it's an incredibly exciting time when they were doing many of the things that you've done, which is they think about the language, they think about knowledge, they think about a world beyond the physical world and how you might understand it, and they're open to all kinds of ideas. And I suppose that's where I saw the parallels, because when I read your work and how you think about the Irish language, it's both that the words they have a thread that takes them back into history chronologically, but they also have a thread that takes them into the ground as well, most of them anyway. So could you, in a broad sense, describe how you think about words in the language, or maybe the totality of the language?
Yeah. Exactly, like I'm not taking the monkey gland injections like Yeats did, but if they were available, I probably would. I'm taking everything else of that nature, to be fair. And I know that, his connection with Madame Blavatsky, and as far as I can get from my grandmother, that my grandaunt, Anna O'Reilly, had connections which she did with that spiritual movement, with the Madame Blavatsky movement too. And I know, there was being deeply intuitive and connection with spirit. So some of that did come down. But so I had been, in 2007, I made a TV series called No Bear, where I went around Ireland just trying to speak the Irish language. And it was a political TV series in a way. I had seen, and there was a census, the 2006 census said that a quarter of the population could speak Irish. And I knew that was a lie. I knew that people were lying to themselves. And I just wanted to explore why that was. So we went out onto the streets all around Ireland, and we made this programme. And it sort of showed up the hypocrisy. It was deeply political, and there was attacks on me from everywhere, from the government, from the civil service, from RT, from everywhere. But I decided, no, wait there. That's not the way I want to engage with this. I want my brother, who's here, Manchán Magan. We spent about 10 years making TV programs around the world. From the first time the TGCAR set up in 1996. So in September 1997, we made this, or November, we broadcast this series about India, and then we went to the Middle East, and we went to South America, we went all over the world. And in all of these places, we focus on minority cultures. And I just saw how beautiful the connection was between the languages the minority cultures spoke and their connection to land. And I thought, then why then am I still trying in my various Irish language work in Ireland, in my articles for the Irish Times or my TV documentaries or my radio work, why am I still repeating those same stories that everyone else says about the language? That either, oh, it's a dead language, or that it was, forced down our throats by bad teachers, or the government has... I just thought, wait there, it's just like one of those languages that I encountered in my time among, the Yami people or the Mosu people or the different peoples all around the world. I want to tell that story. I want to find a way of telling that story. So 32 words for field it's a manipulated narrative. It's a way of telling the story of the Irish language through this romantic way, through the fact that, like, the word critter can describe, or no, maybe cáithnín. Cáithnín can describe a speck of flour, but can also describe a subatomic particle, and can also describe a grain of sand, and can also describe, like, goosebumps. Or the pucín. Pucín can describe, a blindfold or a goat muzzle, or the tin visor you put over a thieving cow. Or pucín can also describe the cloak that you put over your body to make yourself invisible and be able to transverse into different realms. I thought these ideas are so evocative. No one tells us that the word skim, for example, can mean a sprinkling of flour on a table, or can also mean a fairy film that covers the land in the early morning, or can mean a magical dream, or can mean succumbing to the supernatural world through sleep. And I think we all yearn for that type of width, that breadth, that romantic idea, sensibility, the connection to a wider sense of our own identity, of our own selves, of how our bodies are in nature, of how the other world might blend into our world. And it's not in any way, it's not lying, it's not over-manipulating the fact to say that's in the language, but just it hasn't been highlighted yet. So that was all I was trying to do, to show that this language is so much more than something that is translated at cost in the EU of different documents or is taught badly in schools. And had I told these stories 10 years ago, I don't think there would have been the reception for them. But I think we as a people are beginning to open up to this deeper way of engaging with our past.
And beyond that then, and you described it very well, in the book when you talk about the scheme method and the fairy film, you move a little bit further than that, because it becomes, I guess I would think of it as kind of epistemological. That is, how do you know? A whole system of knowing is implied in there, and what you do with that image of the film line over the landscape is that to pierce that, or to go through, is to move beyond into something else. And it's really fascinating reading your work, because you're a little tentative sometimes about what this actually means when you move beyond into something else, out of the rational, for example, and into the spiritual. You're quite careful about how you describe that. And then sometimes you're quite bold about it as well. So could you talk a little bit about that, about the idea that the language doesn't just give you access to historical knowledge, but it may give you access in your, as you see it in your work, to a different way of knowing the world?
Yeah. And so, like, I was so lucky that first I'm so lucky that academia has been so kind and gentle on me. The only place, in fact, there was a little bit of a tax was from Maynooth University, from the medieval history department. Rightly so. Like, the things I get away with are amazing. There was, in the early years, there was a few, like, bitter Twitter attacks, but Maynooth is known for that.
I'll let them know.
At least the medieval history department was known at the time. They had a kind of, and they're right, because there's so many new agey Celtic soft, sandals and breathing ideas latching onto the Irish language. They need to protect their field. But overall, like when I finished a degree in Irish in UCD in '93, and the professor at the time, Brown Donald Buchala, was intent that I would continue in the academic field. He had the little sphere of something in the Donegal Gaeltacht that I was going to focus on. He saw it as I was going to be the direct lineage of TF and Cecil O'Reilly, of the great predecessors. And then even Peter Harbison, when that book came out, he said, Manchán, there's an MA. It's basically an MA. Just go back and learn the academic language. But I've been lucky, because I've been away from that, I was able to take those larger leaps. And I suppose one way I saw it really clearly, in a very practical way, but also a romantic way, was during COVID, I did a project called Sea Tamagotchi, collecting coastal words from fishermen in Donegal, Mayo and Galway. And just to say how easy it is still today, if we want to explore any element of our culture, let's say the field names of a particular place or the holy wells, the knowledge is still there, and every community knows who are the knowledge holders. They're normally at the pub telling everyone and boring everyone, and you just need to be the outsider who goes in and take down the names. You just record it for 1 hour and you have this priceless information. We're at this threshold. Ag ann go bhfuil an tolas an seanolalas fós ann agus go dína go féidir na tuiscintí seo thuirtuing. At this time, where the old language is still there and the people are there who are willing to give us. So, as I said, I went to the fishermen, and like in Galway, they said the older men would never leave a harbour or an anchor point without going deishal, without going sunwise, without orientating them in relation to the direction of the sun. Our Pádraig Keough-Naughton up in the letter in the Pas Belmullet, in the Bell of Widded Peninsula, saying the idea of cablu. And cablu is a word they had for the otherworldly voices that you hear when you're walking on the beach at night. And he's also the man who told me the word cunnic. And cunnic means it's a drop in the water between two peninsulas that can drop by 3 meters at a time, immediately, between two currents. Now, if you have a motorboat, that's never going to be a problem for you. But if you're in a sailboat, if we are in a time where we don't have access to engines, that 3 meter drop can be incredibly important. We don't have a word for that in English. Or like John Babajak O'Conneely in Lettermalin told me the idea of the Boráite. He looks out from Connemara, from the coast there, and he can show me every single Boráite that his father and his grandfather and his great-grandfather knew. And Boráite, it's an underwater reef with the kelp forest on top of it. And as he said, you'll always get mangachi agus balachi I réan Boráite. You'll always get the ballon ras and the pollock there. So it means you're never hungry. If you know where this, like I look out and I see nothing, I just see the sea. But encoded in these words is the knowledge that these are the locations where they can feed themselves. They're incredibly. One third one, when I was asked last year to address the biodiversity conference, the National Biodiversity Conference, I just gave one word, and that was Far Midbo. It's a word from the Brehon Laws, from the old law tracts. And Far Midbo, like we understand it, so it's a word from this law tract was written down in the 9th century, but like linguists will say, it dates from the 4th, probably 5th, maybe 4th century. Far, we still understand from our schoolroom Irish, means man. Mid is just a Latin word, middle. And then bo, or bohan, is a tent or a hut, or a little shed. So it's man between huts, and refers to a young man between 14 and 21. And he is coming of age. So he asks his tribe, he says, I want to become my own man. So he goes to the tribe, they say, okay, there will be a rite of passage. We will give you cattle, and we'll send you up to the high boiler, to the summer pasture. And there you'll have to look after the cattle. You'll have to look after them against the other thieving raids, against the Táin, the raiding tribes, and also against wolves. And if you can look after those for one summer, but not only that, you're going to have to gather up the cock a bow, the cowshite, every evening or every few days, and bring it down to the winter pasture, to feed the winter pasture. So once you've shown that you can not only look after the cattle, which was the symbol of wealth in the tribe, but also make new land, then will allow you to find yourself a woman and start a new family. In other words, it's a term that shows how incredibly sustainable, how incredibly in tune our ancestors were with the land. They only expanded with the knowledge of what the land could take. So there is practical, there is definite, there is realistic and usable information in these old words, in these old mindset that we can use today.
So do you have a sense then of that? You've been working in this area for a while now, and you described some of the work. Do you have a sense of the language reviving or fading at the moment?
So when I think back, the O'Rahilly in 1912 decided they had lost Irish by this stage. His father had a bit of Irish, his grandfather had perfect Irish, but died during the famine, just helping out in Ballylongford, where they were from. So they'd lost Irish. So they realised if they were going to fight for independence, they needed to bring back the language. So he brought my granny and her two brothers and the O'Rahilly's 4 sons, 5 sons eventually, out to the Blasket Island and learned Irish, 1912, 1913, 1914, 15. Then they built a house down there and were there ever since. So I was lucky enough, I was born in 1970, and my granny then knew all the Blasket Islanders. They'd all been forcibly moved to the mainland in the 50s, but they all knew my granny. She had been sleeping on their floor in the Blasket Islands from the 1912s, 1910s. That Irish, that culture that I was immersed in was so rich, was so pure, resonated so deeply back with, one could say a medieval world, one could go further back again to an Iron Age world, over some aspects, maybe a Bronze Age world. I see every time I go back to West Kerry, I see so much more of that weakened. I see the unique way they had of expressing different words, of phrases, of different concepts. We're losing that at an enormous speed. But yet, at the same time, I see on my Instagram, my TikTok account, my social media, this entire revival of people now wanting to come in touch with Irish. It's a diluted form of Irish we are now connecting with, that I have and that everyone around me in the city have, but it is definitely a revival.
So the vocabulary has changed, maybe standardised? Is that part of the issue?
It's just whittled away. It's just this tiny, tiny percentage of what was there. Like that's in October or September of this year, I'll publish a book, 99 words for rain and 1 word for sun. And there's actually way more words than 99 words. Like last year I had a book called Focal Naman, which was 80 words for the vagina and the vulva. There's hundreds more. I just didn't go. And all that requires is any woman in this audience to go to the Gaeltacht, if they know the Gaeltacht, particularly if they know the older women in the Gaeltacht. The words are just there. They've never been collected. You cannot imagine the richness, the depth that is in still there in the Gaeltachtaí, if anyone goes to the Gaeltachts and start looking. We're so fortunate in a way because of Síle de Valera, because of the start of the Folklore Commission, so much was saved. And in a way now where I live, in the Midlands, for the last 27 years, there's so much knowledge that actually is still there that's never been recorded because it wasn't considered romantic to go and collect the folklore of those areas. But yeah, all of that richness I just see is, a lot of it is in the old books, is recorded, but it's not in Igaint Nalina, it's not in the speech of the people anymore.
One of the things that's crucial to your method, as it were, and the way that you think, the way that you write, the way that you come about your books and your television programs is walking and moving through the landscape. And there's a kind of anachronistic term, I think, psychogeography, which is something I've been interested in for a long time, which arises, I suppose it's after the 1950s, and tries but has a tradition that goes back maybe to the Romantic poets, and it's the idea of walking to think. Often in an urban environment, actually, and psychogeography is often associated with urban work. That is, that you walk around a city and you have the leisure to do that, and therefore that you reconstruct a place and you take possession of a place, in a sense, partly because you feel it doesn't belong to you and you want to retake ownership of it. But it also has an implication of a notion that the human is made via geography and cannot exist without some kind of geographical presence, and the contact between the foot and the ground, even through the sole of a shoe, is the thing that makes the person who they are. So how do you think of the relationship that you have, or maybe that we should have, with the landscape of Ireland, and how that can change who we think we are?
Yeah. Again, I would have been helped hugely with my understanding of that through various people in the University of Maynooth, University. Larry Taylor, professor who founded the anthropology department in Maynooth, was a good friend of mine. Lived just down the road from me in Collins Cummerstown in Westmeath for many years, and he was the one who would just open my eyes to what I wasn't seeing around Lough Lane, around Lough Derryvara. In the same way, I have this podcast, the Almanac of Ireland, and the geography department there doing wonderful work on showing the importance of holy wells and seeing different ways of looking at holy wells. But I think the thing that opened up for me was one line in the Shanachas, or the Féin Uacht, which is the lore of the old laws. And there's a line, how do we keep all of this oral knowledge alive, all the Béalidus alive, in a culture that wasn't writing? And so it says, what is the preserving shrine? In other words, how do we keep that information? And they say, easy, it is memory and all that is contained within it. Okay, so there were those elders, in the same ways like Aegon O'Rahilly, my cousin, 4 generations back, my great-granduncle 4 generations back, he would have done studies for many decades to learn that way of thinking. He was based on the Druidic way of thinking, or the Brehons, who were even spent decades training their minds. They could learn large amounts. They knew how to do that. But then it asked the question, what is the preserving shrine? Easy, it is memory and all that is preserved within it. But then it asked the question again, what is the preserving shrine? And this time it says, easy, it is nature and all that is preserved within it. So all of the inherited knowledge of our people going back thousands of years, it's encoded in the minds, but the reason that the minds don't forget is because it is then knitted into the land. And if you think of any old story, any old fairy fable or poem or fairy story in Irish, there is a luganum, there's a place name in every second line. You need to walk the land to feel the stories. And when you do, the stories come back into life. They're not just some quaint story that we learn in school or that we tell, like the Children of Lear, that we tell our American tourists. They become something bigger, that you feel it opening up inside you. It's kind of hard to fully understand it. The only time I finally got to see it, in the last few years, I've been working a lot with native elders in Australia and in North America. And there's a man, Jerry Saddleback, who knows the 16-day creation myth of his people. It takes 16 days and 16 nights to tell it. And I asked Jerry, I said, how don't you forget a line? How come is it not like Dúirt Ban Lum go Dúirt Ban Lay, Chinese whispers that one woman said to me, another woman said to her. And Jerry says, no, I can't get it wrong, he says, Manchán. So this is the stories that the Plains Cree people of the Muscatcheese Reserve have been telling each other for thousands of years, or for hundreds, possibly thousands of years. And he says he goes out onto the land and creates a camp to tell that story. And in that camp, he recreates every river, every mountain, every bog, every tree, every lake that was in the story. So when he's telling, every single line of the story is connected with one of those rivers, trees, rocks, or the direction of the wind or the direction of the sun. So it is on scale, the story is incorporated within the body. You need to be in the place to feel it. And the more these elders who I'm working with, I tell them how much we've lost, and they tell me how they've lost so much more, often because of what Irish people did. It was the Irish people who set up the Indian reservation schools in Canada. It's us who are responsible for wiping out their knowledge. They go out onto the land and they sit there, knowing that the stories have been forgotten, but they sit there until the stories begin to creep back. It's a deeply uncomfortable, unsettling thing for us with our rational minds. I wasn't ever taught how to do that in Gonzaga by the Jesuits or in UCD, but it's something we're going to have to do if we really are going to go back to feel the lifeblood, to feel the pulse of that which is around us.
And one of the things that often appears in your work is a sense of that Ireland as a place has an origin, that it has a beginning point. One of the things that surprises me about your work, I suppose, is that origin point is always pre-Christian, and that while we all know that many of the stories that you draw on have been filtered through a Christian tradition, and in fact probably would be very difficult to access without the monks and those who followed them. That you don't particularly incorporate the Christian tradition into your sense of what Ireland is. You go back to an origin before that. Could you maybe talk a little bit about so it almost gives us a sense of a difference between history and myth, that you leap over history and arrive at least a pre-written history, even if it's not mythological. It's very real to you. How should we understand that intervening period for our sense of who we are now?
It's again why I think academia have been so gentle, why they haven't come out and attacked me. If I put my academic mind on, I could tear my books apart. Like I could tear the books apart. But there's a place for me. There's a place for someone telling a new myth. Like it was clearly what Sheila Humphreys and the O'Rahilly were doing with those, concentrating on Keough-Naughton and Finn McCool. And again, Ruan, my brother who's here, when we made this programme about the O'Rahilly, in 2004 for RTE called The Struggle, we realised we were re-mythologizing the O'Rahilly. We were thinking, well, why not? Like people have done in the 60s, they did it about Pearse. Why can't we tell a story about those people? That's what I'm doing with the land. I can't go too far wrong. I can't make up anything. I can't pull it out of my, my ass. It has to be based enough on fact, because that's what the New Age movement, that's what the pagan and the Wicca movement did. They just made up something. That's what Robert Graves did with the White Goddess. I have to base it on what's there, but just can interpret it in a slightly more easily accessible and romantic way. And because we're living in a post-80s era where there was such a knee-jerk reaction to the church among people, I'm in my 50s, but the church for people in their 30s, their 50s, they're in their 40s and their 30s. People in their 20s have a different attitude because I don't think they sense the oppression. I had to keep away from the modern church because it would have alienated my audience so much. Like I think there's a strong argument to be said that all of the ideas I talk, this romantic way of talking about the language, the land, the mythology, could easily be talked about through a Christian and even a Catholic concept, because so much of the church kept so much of that alive, at least until the famine, at least until the 1840s. And in some ways in West Kerry, the Catholic Church of West Kerry that I was brought up in was still steeped in not only Neamh Breanan, but also Crom Dubh, also the pagan god that went before it. But I've steered away from it just because it's a knee-jerk reaction. A lot of people will just go well away, will step back if you mention that. Whereas if you mention Lu or any of the great gods, they'll love that. So I only have 300 words. I am trying to make an impact on people. I have just as much an agenda as Sheila or the O'Rahilly. I'm trying to make people fall back in love with the language, with the landscape. And I realized that there's huge pitfalls in what I'm doing. And one is, luckily, 32 Words for Field hasn't been published in North America yet, because it could so easily be taken by white supremacists, by the MAGA hat group, mindset, as an idea of some sort of white elitism, white supremacy. And I work a lot with Tyson Yunkaporte, who wrote Sand Talk, this great Aboriginal elder. And it was he who put me onto this. And he said, you need to be careful. And the one reason that they haven't rooted out my work is because I emphasize the goddess so much. It's so clear that although, in the school we taught about Keough-Naughton and Finn McCool and Lou and all these male figures, everything, all of the sacred sites in Ireland that you can think of are places of kingship or places of male battles, testosteronal men, beheading each other, they're actually all of a goddess beneath them. So the work on that, the academic work, is now beginning to be done. This is in terms of me putting out these ideas, at the same time in the universities, the anthropologists, the linguists, the folklorists are beginning to do the hard academic work to root out the stories that give these more credence, more strength. But definitely this, in other words, this more female, this goddess, this more deity-orientated view of Ireland is coming. So the more I focus on that, again, it'll mean that I won't be co-opted into some sort of extremist white supremacy mindset. But again, it involves me making a decision to mold the story I'm telling in a particular direction. And sometimes, I was telling Steve Coleman, who took over professor, lecturer in anthropology, professor, I think, he's retired last year. I was telling him that, it's not right for me to be manipulating stories. And he says, don't you understand? That's what academic does too. Don't worry, he says, we all do this. We all are trying to get somewhere. And I'm so aware that I'm doing this in the context of this decade. If I was telling this story in another 40 years, you would tell an entirely different story. I'm clearly trying to tell an ecological narrative, because I think, having been, having tried to be a member, Tábhachtadh Dála for the Green Party, that there is importance to focus on this green agenda. So that's also, another this bias or this agenda I have.
Yeah. You were on Blind Boy's podcast, you've been on a few times, I know, but you were on it recently and you raised this issue about the ways in which the work that you do might be misinterpreted by those on the right in the US, and a kind of almost a revival of a 19th century German way of thinking about the Indo-European, for example, which is a big aspect of how you think about the story of Irish as having Indo-European roots. And we all know that went in a particular direction from the 19th century into the 20th century. But you also have this focus, you mentioned it a few times, on minority cultures. And then sometimes in your work you talk about Irish culture as you understand it as exceptional or different. So I'm interested in hearing you thinking aloud about whether Irish culture is different, how it's different, and also interconnected as well, because there's another really important aspect clearly of how you think, that you at least you draw parallels, analogies, and sometimes direct links with other cultures. So when you think about India, for example, it seems to me that you're suggesting that there's more of a long historical link between Irish culture and Indian culture, which may go back to some real historical root. But when you talk about Aboriginal culture, potentially Icelandic myth, that the connections need to be formulated in a different way. So could you just talk a little bit about that? And it also that, I suppose those analogies depoliticize in some sense and we help you move away from that politics that you're a little bit worried about being co-opted into.
Yeah. I mean, we're in such a fascinating time that, an event held by Notre Dame and the RIA, is bringing up, Blind Boy, is bringing up references to these. We've never been in a moment at a time like this. There's such openness, there's such an interest and an acceptance that people can not only jump cross disciplines, which is happening in universities, but just cross. You can have a podcast who has, a podcaster who has become obsessed with folklore. This Blind Boy, who has, I've been on it 5 times now, and people are frantic to know this information. It just wouldn't have happened in the past. So, as you say, the next few books are, last November was the book on Ireland and India. And that was just based on knowledge that was done by Miles Dillon, by the great Celtic scholar, published in the 70s posthumously. And then by the Brees brothers from the Welsh, the great Celticist and classicist from Wales, who had traced all of those similarities between Irish stories and Indian Vedic mythology. And of course they're there because Irish and Hindi and Sanskrit were Indo-European languages. So at one stage, we were learning those same farming techniques. When you go up to the Cade of Fields, or even to Belderrig further up, you're finding in Mayo, you're finding the same ways of farming the land that were done in India. And that's only because we're all Indo-European speaking people, that language, and we brought those farming techniques with us. And as they spread, in 500 BC, that same Celtic language, this offshoot of the Indo-European language, was spoken from Turkey to Ireland. We all had the same language, so we all had the same stories, we all had the same mindset. It's always been there. So in one way, there's nothing exceptional about Ireland. We are just part of that Indo-European culture, although with some examples that are visible, that seem to be visible in mythology, that show a knowledge even pre-Indo-European. Like you could say pre-Indo-European, one wave of the Indo-European farming movement was 6,000 years ago, another 4,500 years. But we might even have stories going further back again, but I'll get to that in a second. So in some way, nothing exceptional. We are part of this mass movement of cultures that settled in Western Europe, well, throughout Europe and in Western Asia. But what makes Ireland exceptional to a degree is so much of the old stories stayed alive. As you said, so many of our stories is filtered through the manuscripts. It was written down by monks in the great monastic houses, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th century, up to the 15th century. But some was kept straight in Mail na Líne. Some was kept in the mouths of the people, brought o gloin gloin from generation to generation. But gloin means the knee, So from grandparents' knee to grandchild's knee, grandparents' knee to grandchild's knee, all the way down. That happened in Ireland, and it also happened to a degree in India, really just because we were on the margins. We didn't have that whole admixture. We didn't have that whole intermingling of cultures. We didn't have the Phoenicians, the Romans, the Greeks coming from the south. We didn't have the Goths, the Visigoths, the Huns coming from the north. So we kept some elements of the Indo-European language itself, some of the words that you find in Old Irish and in Modern Irish that you also find in Sanskrit, and some of the old stories. So that's why we're both unique and not unique. There's nothing exceptional. Any of those ideas of deep connection to the river or the land or the mountains or the trees that we can find in our mythology can also be found in every other native culture. And that's going to be a decision, that's still argued over anthropologists. Why is that? Why do we happen to have the same stories in Ireland? Now, Ireland can only be a 9,000 or 10,000 year old culture because, we were covered by a kilometre of ice until then. We know that some earlier artefacts have been found, but at the moment that's the general story that's told. Whereas we have so many of the same stories that you will find in Aboriginal Australia, which is a 45,000 year old, in fact possibly 60,000 year old culture. There can't be any direct connection. But is it that, humans evolve in the same way? Or is it that when we came out of Africa, when we learnt early farming in the Middle East, did we then slowly bring those stories with us? All I need to do is trace the similarities and put them in nice illustrated books. I'm not an academic. I don't know the expertise to go deeper.
So just to end up with this part of the conversation anyway, I'm interested in how you think about the future. One can derive from reading your work a very specific critique of the present, and that's quite a long present. I don't think it's thousands of years, but I think I really enjoyed your anti-Newtonian physics kind of shtick, which appears now and again in the book, and you do that partly by thinking about how the way that the Irish language works seems more like the way the quantum physics works, the kind of post-Newtonian physics, rather than the rationality of Newtonian physics. And I get the sense then from reading your work that you imagine that the present that we live in, the kind of materialist post-age of reason world, kind of post-enlightenment world, is a passing fad in human history, and that we're on the cusp of a slightly different way of understanding the world. And I wonder how we might shape that through the kind of work that you do, and to think about what we might be in the future. Is it primarily, for example, that if you were to put that into some kind of, not manifesto, but something that was akin to a manifesto, it's going to be an ecological vision of the human, a kind of return. And it's no surprise that you stood for the Green Party in that sense. But is that how we might, in your mind, reshape what it is to be human, or be human in Ireland? Because we are, in your work, so interconnected with the land and with language, that we need to reimagine that in a broadly political sense.
Yeah. So, had you met me in 1996, in other words, when my brother came out to me in the Himalayas when I was living up in this cow shed in 1996, I was such an idealistic dreamer at the time. There was no way I'd end up on this stage at that time. I still have a lot of that idealism in me, but now I'm in the point where, I now have stage 4 prostate cancer, as the media keep on telling everybody. So I am entirely reliant on the rational scientific world, but I am equally reliant on that wider way that older cultures had of healing, of listening to the body, of going deep into the body, the ancestral work, the spirit work to heal that. And I don't know which I have more faith in. I mean, it's interesting at the moment, that Newtonian world, when you're face to face with the scientific world, which in relation to a disease that's incurable, according to them, it's so crude, it's so crass. Like in one way we're proud of our scientific mindset. Our scientific mindset is so limited. It's just, we're going to laugh at how arrogant and how limited and how small-minded the last 200 years has been of us believing we have the answers to the big questions. So I think and we can see that from the destruction of our entire environment that science has been at the forefront of. So it's not about refusing science. It's about opening and welcoming science and encouraging science to go into the world beyond, into the more than human world. Because that is the only way we're going to continue as a species. Nature will continue one way or the other. But if humans are going to live in this world, science is going to get off its pedestal. It's going to keep pushing the boundaries. It's going to keep doing what it does with excellence, learning, striving, but without that arrogance, realizing that they are a humble part of nature, that there isn't this type of human sense of excellence, that we need to work with the way that all of our ancestors, any part of the world, in England, in Ireland, in Burkina Faso, in China, have worked with, realizing that we're humbly part of something far bigger than us.
Thank you very much. So I'd love to open it out now to questions. If anybody would like to ask Manchán a question, just raise your hand, and I think we have a mic as well that you can use.
Yeah, as Colin said, I have been focusing on sort of a bigger story than politics, and that was one reason I went for the Green Party very late, because I just thought, okay, this is in January, the election was in February 2016, and I decided this is an opportunity to talk about these things in the media, about ecology and about a bigger way of doing it. So I joined for that reason and left straight after, because just my expertise is not in politics. I don't really have an answer. I do believe that our only way is if those ideas, like the Green Party often call themselves a think tank, and that's really what we need. We need the ideas that the Green Party espouse to be in every political party, not only political party, but every group, the minds and hearts of every family. I think it's a bigger thing than that. In some ways, he's sitting behind you was my brother, who just slapped the head at me and says, no one wants to hear an overeducated waster spouting on with your shite. I needed to find a way of telling the story that would relate to people in the mainstream. And it took me so long. I was regularly on Jerry Ryan and then on Tubridy. And each time realizing when I went too far, when I'd lost the audience, or even the Irish Times, I've been trying to communicate for the last 30 years and realizing, okay, I've gone too far. How can I tell the story in a way that's going to be push the boundaries of idealism, of romanticism, but still be pragmatic enough that I won't lose my audience? It's been a slow and I still go too far a lot, but it's about pushing. It's really hard to be, to prove it or to be actually, to rational about this, but there just seems to be this increased interest. One fact that I point to is Guild Books published my books, and Guild are, the largest publishers in Ireland. They know their market with professional acumen, and they knew that the book 32 Words for Field would sell 5,000 copies. They're never wrong, and suddenly it came out, and whatever, it's sold 65, 70,000 copies by now. Something other than their expertise came along, and that was people are feeling and as I'm quite active on social media, and every day I get these emails and texts and whatever, social media, from people, young people, particularly in their 20s and early 30s, women particularly, and they're the ones who come to my shows, who sell out, who, mean all my shows sell out. They don't really know why they're here, but they feel this feeling of needing, of wanting to connect with the land or the language or something bigger or something older. And it's not just those. It's unusual because they're the people we think are just addicted to their phones. Women in their 60s, and it's particularly women, the men are slowly catching up. But there is this rising awareness. And in one way, the likes of me, those hippie dippies in the 80s, we all heard, and even back before, we all heard about the age of Aquarius. What was the age of Aquarius? It was going to be this sort of a women's mindset, and that a female mindset. That's even when I say that, it's the wrong word, because it's not male versus female. It's not dualistic. It is an earth, a sense of nature, of Mother Nature. And we can see that in our backstory, and even in the sacred kingship and the idea of how Ireland organised itself. The land was in relation in sexual congress with the sun. There was a profound connection to it. And that somehow seems to be alighting in people. I don't know how it's happening. I don't know how it's happening. But it amazes me that it is. And just to say, very soon I'll be cancelled and shut the hell up. Like, I'm a man in my 50s. We've had enough men in their 50s and 60s. I will be gone. There's going to be there are, I know, incredible women in their late 20s and 30s who can say all I can say with way more eloquence and deeper and profundity, who are actually really connected to the land in a way that I'm still so much in my head. Like, because the Jesuits and university got me early, I'm sort of locked in a way that I'm blind to so much of what really matters. Yeah, so I had spent maybe 10 years living in India, in South America, in Africa, and knew eventually that I needed to get home because of this connection, this engagement we had with these Yami elders in Lanyu Island, about 90 miles off the Taiwanese coast. And they said to me, they sang me a song of their people, of their creation myth, of the water, the sea people. I realized I needed to go and I had this resonance, these goosebumps with the songs I used to hear from the West Kerry people when I was young, of Also the Sea. And I thought, I need to go back to Ireland, put down roots. I need to learn I need to grow vegetables through winter, as our ancestors have been doing for ages and ages. And so my granny died, Sheila Humphreys died then, and left me 10 grand. And so I looked all around the country for land and found 10 acres in Westmeath. And Westmeath, this place, Collinstown and Castlepollard, have been incredibly good to me ever since. So that's why. I've just had a young man, Jacob, who works a lot from Montana, who works a lot with the Blackfoot and the Blackfeet, staying with me. And he had to do 2 days in Dublin before he flew home, and he was worried. And I said, just go to the Holy Wells. Go to St. Winifred's Well, just in the Temple Bar, outside the Temple Bar pub. Every American tourist travels there, but they don't notice it. Or go to St. Patrick's Well on the way into the Trinity College, underneath the ground there on the way into the Douglas Hyde Gallery. For me, deep in the city centre, the place is where I find that connection. And wells are like acupuncture points to the aquifer, to the water, and the water is the root of all life in terms of the land, the trees, ourselves. We're so fortunate in Ireland because now we can walk along the Dodder. It's got wilder than it ever has. We can, with the sea we're so lucky between Bray and Howth that we have such wilderness there. So it is definitely harder. But I think that fortunate enough, there have been, even the south side, the few dolmens that remain, there are these little clusters, these sacred places that we can still connect into. And also, because Ireland is so small, you can get west within 2.5 hours. It's not hard to go out to the real places of great profundity, I think. And isn't it lovely with regard to Kerry Doherty, the first of what I hope is a new generation of nature writers, and her book Thin Places and Cacophony of Bones were so vital in making us realise that we can connect with nature, not through an academic way. She's coming out of trauma, and so many of the people who engage with me are coming out of trauma. In fact, so many, because of someone, it's women who realised I was a second-class citizen, or I was actually directly traumatized, and the healing happens through going through into the body and then going from the body into nature. It's so much bigger than just casting away the Catholic Church or casting away politics. It's a sea change, and it isn't just happening in Ireland. It's happening all over the world. As we were talking about Notre Dame and me, we're finding the people who want to engage with the Irish language and myth, it's not just people of Irish extraction. In fact, when I do my shows abroad and my talks, it's people from all over the world. We were, as we know, as is often told, these light bearers after the Dark Ages, the Saint Finians, the Saint Fechines, the Saint Kierans, going to Europe, bringing a more nature-focused, a more sort of idealistic view of how to connect with nature. Maybe that's our role again. We are going to reconnect with ourselves, our trauma, with the land, and then possibly give that message back to people. So you're right. So when Colin was asking me there why I didn't go political, it was because of that. And that's why Owen O'Mahony, the Pope O'Mahony, when he realised my mum and dad were marrying, he thought this could never happen. They were two totally different worlds. So whereas my granny, at least, was such a firebrand, was sort of a violent terrier of a woman, and the O'Reilly had founded an army, though he wasn't quite as violent, I think, as my granny. My father was an absolute different side of the family. They were pacifists. They were Longford farmers going back generations. They were Redmondites. They realized what we need to do is just continue feeding the people, continue growing food in touch with the land, with the seasons, in a very peaceful way, an accepting way. And in fact, I related more deeply to them, and particularly, again, when I was about 17, I went down to visit them again. There had been, it was just before my dad died, I went down and I felt, I resonate with these people. They're not showy, they don't have great stories about being in prison or buying guns, but these are people who have been working the land here in an entirely sustainable way, looking after the community. That lovely word, ara. So ara in Ireland means ara aragadish, or ara ganohiachtacha, the Minister of Finance, the Minister of Foreign Affairs. It is cognate, and it was the same root as Aryan, that complicated word in India, made complicated by the Nazi movement. But the Aryan were the class beneath the Brahmins. So Brahmins and Brehons are the same class in Ireland. Then there was the Aryan and the Ara. And Ara, as we know from school Irish, means caretaker. So the Ara class beneath the Ri, or the Ri and the Raja, again, two classes in Ireland and India that are identical. The Ri, the Ara, they are the caretakers of the land and of the people. And when I see, this Magan family in Killashee, County Longford, that's what they had just been doing. They had been looking after their stretch of land. They had a fair bit of land. They were sort of, what do you call them, gentlemen farmers, not a huge estate or anything, but they had just been looking after the land, the woodlands, the canal that went by from the 18th century on, and then the people. And that probably resonates with me. I'm probably I know I'm way more in tune with my father, with Michael Magan's energy, than that more firebrand, pioneering, proselytizing side of my granny.
Thank you. So just before we finish up, I want to do a little bit of advertising for the series. Just to remind you that we've started a podcast version of the My Identity series. It's on all the usual places, Apple, Spotify, SoundCloud. You find it via the Royal Irish Academy streams on those sites. The first episode's available now, and that's a conversation with the poet Keough McConnell. Keough wrote a book called The Sun is Open. It won the Christopher Ure Biggs Prize in 2022. It's a very extraordinary piece of work. It's about the murder of her father by the IRA, which she witnessed as a young child, and it's the recovery of her father's memory and of her own memory of that time. She's extraordinarily articulate and brilliant person, and I'd really recommend that conversation to you. So that's on there now. And we'll be adding more. We had a conversation here, actually in the Marion Hotel, as part of the series earlier in this year with Naomi Long, who's Minister for Justice in Northern Ireland. That will be added, and we'll be adding this conversation to the podcast list as well. So please do listen to those, and we're on YouTube as well, some of the previous conversations that we've had in this series. But for today, it's been such a pleasure to talk to you. Manchán, you're an incredibly generous thinker, generous person, and you've brought a real breath of fresh air to this conversation. So thank you so much on behalf of all of us for coming today and talking to us.
Thank you.